Brexit, I mean, I was elected to this role because of the referendum, let's be very, very honest. Oxford, Western Abingdon did not like the prospect at the time of Brexit one little bit. And so when it came to the 2017 election, I very much thought that we'd get it sort of close, but then I would pass the baton. I had secured a job as a deputy head in a school in Wembley. I mean, that was my first love and passion. That's what I was going to go and do. I remember this conversation with that head saying, don't worry, I'm never going to be elected. Pigs will fly. She said, Trump's just been elected. Pigs do fly. I was like, no, no, no. And yeah, lo and behold, there was a slightly sheepish phone call the following day. Having gone to the count, being told I'd lost, because in fact I only won by about 800, and it wasn't clear until well into the night that I'd actually won. And boy, was that Parliament, and you were involved in it too. That Brexit Parliament was a baptism of fire. And all of us who were newly elected in those 2.5 years feel like, all of us, that we had 10 years of politics in those 2.5, because they were bringing back so many old procedures from hundreds of years ago that had never been used before. I mean, it was this enormous. I don't even know how to describe it without being rude. I mean, I think we were just also anxiety-ridden over those 2.5 years, and Parliament just wasn't made for the consequences of a referendum like that. Our entire constitution, I think, was sorely tested, and I would argue was found somewhat wanting in the way that it prosecuted itself. And we had this enormous learning curve that we all went on. I think we're still recovering from some of that, interestingly, but I can't believe that's 7 years ago. I mean, politics goes by very quickly.
I mean, I imagine it feels a lot nicer now in Parliament and a lot calmer, but on the other hand, I mean, there was something quite refreshing about Parliament, as it were, taking back control, wasn't there? I mean, the government couldn't tell Parliament what to do in those years.
But that was a result, not necessarily, I don't think. I mean, so that was the election where Theresa May lost her majority, and I think it's a consequence of hung parliaments, actually. I'm not sure it was necessarily the Brexit question. There's an excitement about Parliament properly being sovereign, and a hung Parliament is the greatest expression of that. It was one of the arguments for why the Lib Dems went into the coalition in the first place, was to kind of prove it could work, but also in the blind hope that we might affect electoral reform, and actually we would have more of that kind of compromise Parliament. I still believe that fundamentally compromise is a better position for a country to be in than not. And I do think that, this massive majority that we find ourselves with now, and if you look back to, I mean, Boris has royally messed it up, but he had a big majority as well. Parliament feels a bit like redundant when you have those kinds of majorities. It's at its best, I think, when there's that tension that actually at any moment the government may actually have to listen to what backbench MPs have to say. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's a good tension to have in Parliament.
Presumably the compromises will be inside the Labour Party in
But that's the point.
But
That's like disagreeing with like is not much of a compromise and isn't representative of the wider democracy, especially on small shares of percentages of votes, which is the problem we've got, I think, at the moment.
So you've had your best ever performance as a party. You've got 72 MPs now. I don't want to relitigate the election, but what was it anything more than people didn't like the Conservatives? I mean, that's one way of looking at your success, isn't it? Is you weren't Tories in the right places.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've got to be really honest about the things that we were able to affect and the things that we weren't. You, as Lib Dems, expect that you are going to get squeezed mercilessly from both sides. It happens every time. We come into an election with this, brilliant manifesto. I joined the party because I was, interested in education. I looked across at all the manifestos. I compared it to the masters that at the time I was doing at the Institute of Education. I compared policy to what the research was showing, and I landed on the Liberal Democrats. I mean, I was that geeky about, what I was going to try and advocate for. And that's sort of how we all operate. And so we always think that when we go into the election, we're going to go in with this strong manifesto. We're really proud of the fact often the IFS says that we have the best sort of costed manifesto and all this stuff. And then we find the election campaign, sometimes through own goals, but sometimes simply by virtue of being the third party in a two-party system, we get squeezed down because the electorate has to do a lot with its one vote. It needs to not just elect its own representative, who's the best person for the area, but it's also thinking about who do I want to be the Prime Minister. And you find that sort of cognitive dissonance is very real on the doorstep. Some of you as electors might have felt the same thing. Oh, is it worth taking a risk to vote for a Liberal Democrat when actually I know for a fact that they're not going to be potentially the party of government? And so that is actually the biggest factor. If you look across the history of Liberal Democrats and Liberal Democrat campaigns, that is the big squeeze that happens on both sides. What was different this time, and honestly, we kept waiting for the Tory party to wake up. Oxfordshire, very proud to say, I was 1 out of 7 seats in the end. 6 became 7. We had boundary changes, so there were some changes across the country. At, I would say, my very outermost hope, maybe we'd get 1 other, maybe we'd get 2, probably the rest would be Tory. Obviously, we'd keep Annalise Dodds in Oxford itself. As it happens, we have now no longer any Conservative MPs in Oxfordshire, true blue Oxfordshire, and 5 out of the 7 of those seats are Liberal Democrat. And that was in part because over the course of both the coalition years and beyond, we realised our only hope was to campaign like mad. And that was in our hands. So this is, you know, what we do really well as Liberal Democrats. We get under the skin of local issues. We encourage people to come out and deliver leaflets. And if anyone here has ever been involved in a Lib Dem campaign, you'll attest, I hope, that we do a lot of that door-knocking stuff, and it's really important. But a lot of it was out of our hands, and we kept waiting for the Tories to wake up, and they just didn't. We didn't hear a peep. There might have been the odd candidate who did 1 or 2 things, but the national campaign was nowhere. And I compared it to 2015, when we had that enormous defeat. Boris Johnson was, in fact, running that campaign. I think they called it the 50-50 campaign, 50 to win and 50 to defend. It was a brilliant campaign. And every few weeks, you had leaflets through doors, and they changed the national conversation through the course of that campaign. But the Tories were nowhere. And I think that was as much a signal as anything else, let alone what they'd actually done to the country, that we needed a change. It wasn't just, you know, in government. Actually, the party had hollowed itself out and had lost a lot of its grassroots. So who knows what's going to happen next time? But I think the collapse of the Conservative Party has as much to do with our success as anything else. But I don't want to diminish it, because so many of our seats were won by margins of 1 or 2,000, 600, you know, that kind of thing. That is down to the campaign itself. And we recognised what was in our control and what wasn't, and we played to our strengths. So I don't want to diminish what the HQ team did. They did a really cracking job.
I mean, you talked about policy and the importance of policy and things like that, but actually, I mean, for a cynical observer like me, your national campaign was a series of bungee jumps. And I remember those.
I did not know he had it in him. I honestly don't. I've worked with Ed for the best part of 7 years before this point, and he's a laugh, don't get me wrong. He's fun to have a glass of wine with, and, you know, I like him very, very much. I had no idea this was in him. So I'm delighted to have seen that slightly more playful side, especially when we knew that, you know, the Conservatives were messing everything up. But the sense of sort of doom and gloom in the country as a whole, you could feel it, and it's still here. You know, we've had war in Ukraine, cost of living crisis, Gaza, a lot of very, very heavy, heavy things that are weighing on people's hearts.
You don't think that trivialises politics?
I don't, because, well, 2 things. First of all, you have to also appreciate, as a third party, we don't get any major national newspaper giving us the time of day. And it's already clear. We have chats with journalists all the time. If you're the government and you have something to announce, the bar is very, very low. You know, literally, you can announce anything and they will cover it. If you're the opposition, the bar is a bit higher. And then if you're the third party, or indeed at the time considered the fourth party, you're basically an irrelevance. You've literally got to grab the attention. So it's all very well grabbing the attention, but then what did we do with it? And I think this is where, again, I'm going to give credit to the campaign, because throughout the previous few years, especially kind of, and we'll come back to Brexit, I'm sure, but there was a perception that we had kind of gone off into our own little bubbles. We were just talking to people who agreed with us. And as delightful as that is, it didn't do us any good in the previous couple of elections. So what they did was they did a lot of conversations, doorsteps, focus groups, polling, and the campaign was played right smack bang into what people cared about. And I think they've got it right. And I would say this is the chair of the Health and Social Care Committee, but the NHS. The NHS and social care, if you talk to anyone on the door, they will almost invariably identify with that as a campaign issue. And it says a lot, I think, that now, you know, the Labour Party had a choice as to which committee chairs they gave to who. There's a reason we got this one. And it's because we established ourselves as a party that is credible on this issue, particularly social care, which is very often the poorer cousin. And that's not a mistake. They did that because they want us to talk about it, because they recognise that as a useful thing for us to push on. So, you know, credit to them for letting us have it, but I think credit to the campaign and Ed for making that the main issue that we spoke about in the election.
Okay, I've got a couple more questions on the election. Before I do, just for those watching online, stick your questions on Slido. We are going to have a roving mic in the room a bit later, but if you've got a question that pertains directly to something that Layla says and you stick it on the Slido, we might be able to slot it in then. So if you want to scan the link and do that, you can do that as well. But just a couple more things on the election. I thought this was the most interesting election ever, I have to say. I mean, there's so much interesting stuff that came out of it. But a couple of things. I mean, firstly, the popular perception was that you had a poor election in 2019. In seat terms, you did. But actually, in vote share terms, you had a pretty good election, didn't you? And actually, you ended up being second in a whole number of seats that you won in 2024. Was it hard to sit down and sort of rationally think? I mean, I imagine the gut reaction was, let's not think about that. But how did you sort of learn lessons from that?
Well, we did. And, you know, Lib Dems overanalyse everything. It's one of our strengths, I would argue. And we have a general election review every time. And rather than just be sort of, you know, wringing our hands and, you know, what went wrong, there was a process by which we looked at this sort of kind of in the round and a recognition that we did really well, but the other part that was missing was the targeting strategy. Now, Lib Dems are usually very good at targeting, particularly when it comes to local elections. We're taskmasters at it. But in this general election, we kind of let it go. And the thought being that this was a Brexit election, which it was. I mean, that was one of the main things that was coming out on doors at the time. That was, every election has its thesis question, the thing that the electorate mainly want to answer. And that was, you know, we'd chosen our horse and we were riding it and we were going to go to the end come what may. I don't think necessarily that was a mistake. I think some of the tone of it was a bit not quite right.
Bollocks to Brexit.
I'm not even sure the bollocks to Brexit. I think the thing that did it for us was that we're going to change this unilaterally if we win a majority, and it just became a bit hubristic, and the tone wasn't right. That said, do I regret for 1 second that we campaigned to stay by any means possible inside the European Union, given the damage that we can now see that has done to our economy? I stand by that. That was the right thing to do at the time. But what we didn't do was identify which were the 50 seats where we were most likely to get over the top, and how do we best direct our activists towards it. So that was the main lesson we learned.
Okay. I mean, this was a very targeted campaign. I mean, my fun fact about the Lib Dems in this election is I think 46% of all the votes you received, you got in the 72 seats you won, which if you think about how big this country is staggering. But the danger of that surely is that you've peaked. That actually there aren't any seats outside the ones you won that you can eye up for the next election, because basically this is as good as it gets. Is that fair?
I don't think that's fair, for a couple of reasons. One, nothing like success to drive ambition. So we are very ambitious now. And you see the demise of the Conservative Party, and I'm enjoying it greatly, I have to tell you. I'm sure we'll come on to that. But I mean, I don't think the Tories are done finding the bottom of the barrel. I think they've got a little way still to go. Right. And if you look at the next slot of 30 seats, some of them have only been won by the Conservatives by a margin of 1,000 or 2,000 votes. So there are still seats to be won. There were also a couple of seats that I think the Labour Party won that I consider more natural Liberal Democrat territory, places where we weren't campaigning, didn't set ourselves up as the alternative. And what we're already starting to see, and it's more of a tactical thing, we are pleased the Tories have gone, the Labour Party is not our enemy, we want them to do well, it's the right thing for the country right now. But in terms of just specific seats, some of those more rural constituencies that are not natural Labour territory, I think will be quite interesting to watch in how they move over the next 4 or 5 years. We're already starting to see in by-elections, they're not doing terribly well in them. They don't really have the campaign infrastructure in the same way that they do in the urban centres. And things like the winter fuel allowance mistake has really hurt them dearly. And these are voters who would naturally have voted Conservative, looked for an alternative, so it was an ABC election. I mean, bluntly, let's face it, anything but the Tories, everything but the Conservatives. And if you were in a seat that was somewhere else in the country and all you heard was Keir Starmer on the radio and the television, that set yourself up as that's the natural alternative. There may be opportunities there. Those are more opportunistic, but for us, the strategy, frankly, we are talking openly about a strategy of replacing the Conservative Party as the main opposition of government. And if they continue in the direction that they are going, it's ambitious, don't get me wrong, we've been here before, but it would only take 30 seats to change hands, and actually we're in that territory again. It's within reach. And why not have a dream?
Okay, I mean, dreaming's good, but to do that, you're going to have to define yourselves as something other than not the Conservatives, aren't you? I mean, in a sense, that's the task that faces the Liberal Democrats in this election. Is the next election, you can't be not Labour. I wouldn't have thought. We never know how badly they'll do. But you're going to have to be we are X rather than we're not Y. And that's going to be quite difficult, isn't it?
I think it just, I don't want to predict what the next election is going to be like. I mean, can you imagine having this conversation a year, just a few months into Boris Johnson's thing? We had, all of the big upsets that we've had, events, dear boy events, but also Boris Johnson himself. Like, we just had no idea how that was going to go. And I think it's also fair to say that I found, personally, the first 100 days of the Labour government have not been what I expected. They
In what way?
I thought they'd be more on it. I thought that they had more of a plan for, and I say this having spent the previous 7 years in the same lobbies as a lot of the people who are now ministers. I have a lot of respect for them, and I don't want to in any way sort of set us up against, we worked for the same ends for 7 years, which was to try and get the Tories out. That's where we grew up together, many of us who were elected at the same time, and I'm delighted for those who have now got into those executive positions of power. And I remember conversations where they're like, we're preparing, we're thinking about it, we're confident, we're not taking anything for granted, but there was a genuine sense behind the scenes in Parliament that they had thought a lot about this stuff. And I don't see any evidence of that now.
Yeah, my experience of talking to people who are now in Cabinet is they thought an awful lot about winning the election and how to win the election. I'm not convinced at any point many of them were thinking, it was almost like there's that sort of curse of being Labour, isn't there? Until the very last minute, whatever the polls say and for however long they say it, you're terrified you're going to lose. And that just seemed chronic to me, that actually you campaigned to win, but you didn't campaign to govern. So A, they didn't have a plan, and B, the way they campaigned slightly tied. If you look at what the promises on tax and so on.
I think that's fair. But I think I was personally, and as I say, I'm an outsider and I'm not a Labour, and I was lulled by the sort of the Sue Gray stuff. I was like, okay, they've got Sue Gray in, she knows her way around the civil service, she's going to translate all of this stuff into something that Whitehall understands. And as I've, grown longer in the tooth as an MP, it's all very well understanding Parliament. It's quite another thing understanding how Whitehall works and how to get stuff done. So I thought they basically found their translator and that therefore there was a plan. So when you then started to see all this sort of internal stuff that was going on, it was quite disappointing. I wanted them to do better. Genuinely, I wanted them to do better. My constituents deserve better government, and it has been disappointing. And we're starting to see some of that feed into, actually, when people are able to vote on the ground, the Labour vote is very, very soft in places where there are sitting Labour councillors. There's a long way to go between now and the next election, but there is a long way to go between now and the next election. So let's see where we are. And I think, from our perspective, we do have the advantage of being the third party. Our job is in some senses to be the conscience of the nation, to say the things that maybe sometimes can't be said, to take the position that is very much the voice of our constituents and put that in there. That is the, you know, the joy of not being in government. But that said, you know, we are ambitious and one day believe that a Liberal government is the answer to a lot of the problems that the country is facing, particularly nationalism, populism. I started by saying I want compromise. I want a parliament that listens to more backbenchers. We wanted to bring the parties together, and that remains at the core of what it means to be a Liberal. I genuinely think that if we had more of that in British politics, then people would feel that the government and Parliament in general was more responsive to their needs. And I'm terrified by the shares of votes that governments are getting with these massive majorities. They do not match. And that is eroding our democracy. This isn't just about fairer votes and proportional representation. This is bigger than that. And I honestly think that the answer to that is liberalism. I would, wouldn't I? But I came to this conclusion having not been at all political as a child. My dad's a Labour man, he says that very proudly. My mum is British, but is Palestinian origin. Politics was around the dinner table, but not party politics in this way. So I've always approached it from the point of view of which, if there were an ideology, and I'm not wedded to any one, if there were an ideology, which is the one that's going to get the best outcomes? And I genuinely think that liberalism is the best one on offer.
So where does that put you in relation to the big two parties then? Are you planning to criticise Labour from the left or from the right? I mean, where does the party sit? Because it is remarkable, there's 72 of you, and I don't know where you hover in the sort of parliamentary arithmetic.
Yeah, I mean, I think it says a lot that we talk about that left-right axis in the way that it is. You know, so we've got and it's more sort of on economic terms. So on taxation, on things like that, we are always on the side of the most vulnerable, hence why we have not agreed with the way that the winter fuel payments have been prosecuted. I don't mind that people who can afford not to pay don't pay. My worry is my constituents who really, really are struggling are finding themselves in a position where they're choosing between heating and eating, and that should not be the case. So we protect the most vulnerable when it comes to things like taxation, benefits, and that kind of thing. I would point out, yes, Bevan was the Labour minister who created the NHS, but off the back of the Liberal Beveridge report, which created the welfare state in the first place. So we believe in a strong welfare state, but we also believe, and you know, so that's left, right, in that axis, but we also believe in, you know, the free market. It's why we believe in being part of the European Union. It's why we now talk about wanting to go into the single market for the sake of business. We believe that if you do that, you strengthen our economy. By that measure, we're right. So which are we? Well, I mean, classically, and this is going back 100 years now, we would have rejected that axis. Actually, the axis that liberals sit on is the liberal authoritarian axis. And that centralising tendency of both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party is one of the things that we rail against. There are things that the Labour Party are doing that I would agree with. So in the NHS, for example, they talk a lot about the neighbourhood NHS. And they're talking about devolving power into communities. That's a good thing, but forgive my scepticism, because when I was first interested in politics and I was looking at those policies that the Labour Party was putting forward under Blair, that was not the instinct. The instinct was to gather power into the centre. And so this would be a very different approach from Labour to classically how they've been before. But that's the axis we prefer to be on, is the, you know, liberal authoritarian axis. And then who do we, it's not about attacking, it's about where are our values. I think they're entirely consistent. And you could say some are left and some are right, but I wouldn't maybe use that measure.
I mean, I see there the values axis would be a useful one, whoever wins the Tory leadership election, because there'll be plenty of fights to be had there. But, you know, with Labour, you're not going to have that liberty. I mean, you're going to have difficult things like VAT on school fees, for instance, where I think the Lib Dems basically are the MPs in some of the richest, the most affluent seats across the country, where presumably there are a lot of parents sending their kids to private school. Does that put you on the, I mean, again, I'm sorry to use the term, but in a sense, does that push you towards opposing what Labour are doing?
So, I mean, I was education spokes for a long time. And so the issue I have is the principle of wanting more resourcing to go into state schools and wanting more more people who go to state schools to have better opportunities. On that, we are completely agreed. The question then becomes about how do you achieve that in such a way that is fair? And so, define fair. Are middle-class families who can afford to pay £13,000, £14,000 a term, let alone a year, is taxing them a bit more and asking them to pay a bit more the right way to do it? Perhaps. But there are a couple of things that make me very uncomfortable. First of all, you wouldn't be able to do this if it weren't for Brexit. Mm-hmm. So under EU rules, you weren't allowed to tax education. As a principle, if we are trying to, in our longer-term aims, to be closer in alignment with European standards, to stay close to our European cousins, I'm just uncomfortable that we are starting to diverge in areas like this. It makes a rod for our own back, and I think there's a bigger strategic aim out there. Second of all, I'm not entirely convinced that this is going to solve the problems. I think it's potentially going to cause problems in some parts of the country, in terms of role and so on. And my preferred option, and the Liberal Democrats had this a long time ago, but a penny on the pound on income tax for education, where you started to phase out those private schools, or the need for those private schools. But I understand the instinct of parents to want to send them to that. If you've got a SEND system that isn't working, if you've got CAMS that is not seeing people or giving them their diagnoses, if you've got EHCP plans where the H is silent and basically the children who need it the most just aren't getting the help that they're going to need, how can you punish those parents for often giving up a lot in order to give their children the best? So I am uncomfortable with this proposal, not its aims. And we've got to make that really clear, not its aims. Those with the broader shoulders should carry the most burden, but I'm not sure the detail of how it's happening is actually going to end up helping. And so we've ended up, but do you know what? That's not to do with my postbag. Oxford, West and Abingdon, and you'll know, has plenty of private schools. Mm-hmm. The thing I really bulk at are those private schools who are charities, who get, the tax break from the Exchequer, and then basically don't do enough to give back to their local communities. And I've got a number of schools that do this really well. I'm also very aware of a number of schools that don't do this barely at all. And so they just use the charitable status, and then it's a fig leaf. That would have been my preferred option. And
that was the Labour policy a few years back.
And I think that's fair. If you're going to give those schools a tax break, which being charitable status is, they need to earn it. They need to prove that they're earning that tax break. But this is blanket, and I'm just uncomfortable with the detail, which I think, doesn't undermine the principle.
Okay, I just want to ask you one more quick thing before turning to some of the sort of substantive issues, including Brexit, which is Ed Davey, amongst others, has expressed some reservations about the changes to planning laws that Labour are going to bring about. What exactly is the reservation? And without doing it, how would you start to secure the sort of growth that everyone seems to agree we need? I mean, Isn't that the most obvious lever that a government can pull? They can, but is the centralising nature of these plans the way to achieve that outcome? So I say that because Liberal Democrats have historically been very good at local government. If we have success, if we have toeholds in places, it has tended to be in councils. And the places that have delivered housing growth have done it notwithstanding the current system. And the things that get in the way are land banking from those big developers who decide to buy up a bunch of land, wait until the economic cycles are in their favour. They wait and they wait and they wait. And if they're asked to build earlier, they decide that they're not going to deliver affordable housing. They're not going to deliver any for social rent. And they then hold off until it's in their interests to be able to build this stuff. Meanwhile, the biggest objections that local communities have to any of this is a lack of infrastructure. So I have, more than 1,000 homes, for example, going in and around Abingdon. There is no sign of how the system is going to deliver the GP surgery that they need, the extra school places that they're going to need. And it's just pragmatic. So when people, particularly outside of, and we've got a specific issue in places like London, Oxford's quite interesting in its city centre, but where I represent also includes the areas around it. You can do this if you are giving people the reassurance in the infrastructure that they need up front. My concern
is that by increasing the target of building homes, you actually don't really address those issues. You don't address the core issues of why people feel that this isn't fair. And you actually end up then having people going to judicial review, they start putting blocks in, they're called NIMBYs, it's just not working. So Liberal Democrat councils have done it. You know, the Vale of Whitehorse District Council, which is just on the edge of Oxford, has delivered the highest housing growth in the country as an average over the last 10 years. And the reason why, very occasionally, you might object to bits of greenbelt going is actually because we are actually putting a lot of housing in, but also trying to deliver the infrastructure at the same time. So I'm just not sure. So when we've got a target of 150,000 new council homes over the course of the Parliament, that's, every year over the course of the Parliament, that's a hugely ambitious number. And I'm not sure that the centralising targets that miss all the social homes is the way that you're going to get the equity in house building that we want. What is the point of building masses of executive homes that people can't afford if what you're trying to solve is the problem of, I want to stay close to my parents so they can help me look after my children and I don't want to leave my communities?
Though, to be fair, we don't really know the detail yet of how centralised it's going to be, do we? Because they're talking a good game about devolution. We don't actually know. I mean, there is, it seems to me, a tension between some of their central targets and some of their devolution rhetoric, but we're none the wiser as yet.
I accept that, and I think you know, those of us who are Lib Dems who decided actively, you know, especially if we sit on the left of, I was never going to be a Tory. I did look on the website when I was doing my research. I did honestly, like, I'm going to give them a fair hearing, and I saw Cameron and his Huskies and all the rest of it, and I was like, yeah. But I mean, it was either going to be one of the Lib Dems or Labour at the time. And the reason I'm a Lib Dem is because I was seeing what was happening in education. I was seeing that sort of top-down, target-driven, managerial approach of the way they were trying to change the system. And I knew from working in the sector that the way you did that was bottom-up, and you know, that you gave people more power closest to those it affects. I then later learned that is liberalism. And I'm a Lib Dem because that doesn't apply just in education. That also applies in things like housing. I think local councils, given, you know, better multi-year funding settlements, the ability to borrow at lower cost, with big targets to set up social housing, not housing as a whole, but social housing, I think they could achieve a lot. And I think they would do it in a way that was much less likely to cause friction. And, you know, I think we need to move away from this rhetoric of you're a NIMBY or you're a YIMBY, or, you know, there's a lot of mudslinging in this. Actually, we all want the same thing, good homes for people so that they can create communities and then live good lives. I think we're all aiming for the same thing. I'm just sceptical about, forgive my scepticism, but I'm not a Labour Party politician for a reason.
Though it does seem to me there are quite a lot of people who want more homes just somewhere else. I mean, I understand that the language might be sort of unnecessary, but it is a genuine issue, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's also unhelpful. And I'll give Oxford as an example. Their local plan has just been kiboshed by the planning inspector because their expectation is that everyone else will be able to build them, and they just simply aren't doing enough of their own. People understand that in urban centres there is less space, but there's also, in some cases, a little bit of a lack of will to even try. And so that duty to cooperate, which is the bit of the National Planning Policy Framework, if anyone wants to fall asleep early at night, I encourage you to read it. But as an MP, you become a little bit expert on these things because that is the core of the problem. And where you've got situations where it's just an expectation that everyone wants to work in the city and live somewhere else, that causes its own problems. You know, you've got commuting, for example. You're trying to cut down on air pollution, you're trying to cut down on commuting times, give people a better life. And at the moment, that's just not what's happening, in Oxfordshire anyway. So we find ourselves in a situation where we're at odds with the City Council, who are wanting everyone else to build their housing, and they get all the business rates from the jobs that happen where they are. And that's just not feeling very fair to people.
Okay, so moving on to your last job, as it were, though I know it's a job that's still close to your heart. In fact, I think today, didn't you introduce your Palestine recognition bill?
I've had it for the last 7 years, Palestine recognition.
So let's just talk about Palestine for a moment. I mean, have Labour done enough so far to try and bring about a ceasefire? I mean, realistically, is there much that Britain can do?
Yes. Yes. Have they done enough? No. But is there much that Britain can do? Absolutely. Certainly much more than they have. I regret that the government as a whole, and this is mainly the Conservative Party at the time, is there much they can do now? I think there still is. I think there's still more sanctions that could be imposed. I think we need to be clear about arms exports. So when people say, will that stop Israel from defending itself against Iran? Let's be perfectly honest. We barely give them any of those arms that are doing that. The Iron Dome is mainly America. We've got space to be able to do more here.
But is that code for saying it would be tokenistic anyway because we give them so little?
But in the space of, and I say this, my father was an ambassador for most of my life. When those gestures, those diplomatic gestures that governments make on the world stage matter, they really matter. But I think there's also a sort of moral injury that we're causing ourselves as a country by not doing more. And there was an opportunity about 11 months ago where I genuinely think we could have done more. But I also think there is still more that we could do, especially as America, because of its election, has absented itself from this issue right now. It is quite understandably focusing inwards on itself, as elections are wont to do. And Britain has a historic obligation in all of this. My great-grandfather was a man called Wasif Jawhariya. He wrote contemporary diaries of the British Mandate from 1918 onwards. They're quoted as source material for books like Jerusalem by Simon Sebag Montefiore and others. And he spoke at the beginning of how he resented the fact that those who were coming to settle took their lands and all the rest of it. And by the end of his diaries, he hated the British more than he hated those who came to settle, because he felt so betrayed by what had been promised to them, in particular, the lack of any kind of equal political rights. So the reason I put down the Palestine recognition bill is not just because of, it makes me feel good, and it does, and I feel like if you believe in a two-state solution, which I genuinely believe is the only option, I understand those who say, we want one secular state where everyone gets an equal vote and it's too late because of the settlement. I get all of those arguments, but I just think that it's now got so emotionally fractious that you've got to have a staging post in between, and perhaps two states is that. But how do you have two states when you've only recognized one and you just don't recognize the other? It should be a given that the state of Palestine exists. It is not either a carrot or a stick. It just simply is. And it's a nonsense to recognize the state of Israel without recognizing the state of Palestine. One makes the other less secure and vice versa. So they could recognize, and that would send an enormous signal. It is true that there are other countries that have done it, and what difference has it made? I accept that as a challenge, but Britain still hasn't done it. And Britain doing it in the context of this region and the context of our history really would make a difference. But there is more. We still trade with illegal settlements. They don't get preferential treatment according to the trade agreements we have, but we still trade with them. And how many people genuinely look at the label and check whether or not that particular good was made in an illegal settlement?
But we've announced some sanctions on those.
On individuals, but not on goods.
Okay.
So the goods is still, and I just don't understand. There is a new trade agreement between the UK and Israel in train. It's been being negotiated for years now. My own view is, we should be putting a complete halt on that until this is over and we've dealt with the issue of settlements. Settlements are the big issue. They aren't needing to be dealt with. And the sanctions that you speak about are about individuals, and also it's beginning to start to be entities as well that we're beginning to sanction. But we are behind the curve. America's done more than us on these sanctions. So there is plenty more for us to do. And what I'm finding interesting about this parliament compared to the last, I'll play my teeny tiny violin, but it has felt for years, well before Gaza. I mean, I've been pushing on this for well before Gaza for very obvious reasons. Until this year, I was the only Arab MP, let alone Palestinian. And there's a woman in the Labour Party from Yemen, and it's just wonderful to have someone else who's got a link to the region. But it did feel like, we were warning, we were saying this is a tinderbox, we're seeing the violence in the West Bank, we could see, how much worse this was getting, and we were raising the alarm, but I kind of felt a little bit alone. There were some notable exceptions to that, and they're very helpful and brave. But in this election, in part, it was a small part of the election, but in some constituencies, they caused massive upsets. And I think it's true to say that in some parts of the country, Gaza was an election issue.
Oh, God, yeah.
And that means that for a number of MPs, they feel they have to engage. And for me, that's just amazing. What I'm trying to do is steer those, especially the new MPs, we've got to move the centre of it. It's not enough to just sort of be a protest group within Parliament and you know, say things that get many shares on TikTok and Instagram and then that's it. And it makes you feel great, but actually what are you doing to help people in Palestine and indeed Israel who want peace and two states? So I'm working as broadly across the House as I possibly can and trying to demonstrate from how I engage with this that you can reject the sort of one side or another narrative and actually there is a shared future, it's there, and to those who say it's far away, well, fine, but how many times do you achieve something with never having imagined it first? You have to talk about it, even if it feels very far away.
Now, I want to turn briefly to Brexit. I mean, we argued about this in Brighton. So the Lib Dems have a plan, and it's a long-term plan, isn't it, which is improve relations, ultimately join the single market, then one day think about rejoining. I mean, that's not for now, is it? This is a plan over decades, isn't it?
As quickly as it can be achieved, but I think we need to be really honest about how long it's potentially going to take. I have in the past sort of said, oh, I'd love it, you know, and I think to myself, I want to benefit from this, so I'm thinking, oh, I want it in the next 10 years or 20 years or whatever. We are seeing the effects of this all the time. I thought it was remarkable that during the election, you know, we're talking about an election that was in part all about cost of living in the economy, and yet we were raising it, it was in our manifesto, but the single biggest lever that you could pull is to remove that red tape from businesses and talk about joining the single market again.
Why don't you suggest doing that? I mean, but you don't suggest doing that now, do you?
But we do. I mean, it was in the manifesto. We do. And so is the longer-term aim of becoming a member. I mean, it's there. But I think we also recognise that, I mean, if you go to Brussels, my parents still live there, by the way. My father was, I said he was a diplomat. He was an EU diplomat. It's steeped in us. And they don't want to talk about this stuff. Mm-hmm. What they do want to talk about, though, and this is our frustration, and we have been talking about it, and it's been raised by Ed at PMQs, are things like the Youth Mobility Scheme. And it happened again yesterday, asked in the House about the Youth Mobility Scheme, in a quite innocuous way, the minister then starts talking about freedom of movement, and no one wants to prosecute the referendum again. It's like a Tory takeover of some of the rhetoric coming from the Labour Party, and it's so frustrating to us. No one thinks, or is talking about Youth Mobility Scheme in the context of freedom of movement. It is not freedom of movement, and yet that is the language that they're choosing to deploy. And it's deeply, deeply frustrating. So we've got to start somewhere. And if we can't even achieve that, how are we going to convince the government that we go the next step and rejoin Erasmus, and then we do a veterinary agreement, and then we do the single market, and then we move on from there? So there is a plan, but we've got to work on the next step. And the next step right now is getting the Labour Party, and you know, Keir Starmer's not stupid. He was the one who led in that Brexit Parliament talking about the reasons why all of this was a bad idea, and he was so impressive. And you know, I know he knows this stuff. So it can only be political reasons why they're choosing to talk about it in those terms, and it's deeply, deeply disappointing. So that's the fight we've got. You fight, you win the fight in front of you, and then you go on to the next one. Okay, well, let's assume then this is a sort of medium-term project. We're talking 10, 20, maybe 30 years. Yeah. But I was struck by what you said about VAT on school fees, that if our medium-term objective is to be back in the single market, we should just not diverge from the EU and it'll be a lot easier. Isn't that, in a way, just simply accepting the worst of all worlds for what might be decades? Because what if the EU starts passing loads of regulations that are just a bit rubbish for our economy? I mean, you think financial services, for instance. Do we really say, well, one day we might be debating rejoining, so actually we're going to have to go along with that? Doesn't that just hobble your economy short term? I think there's a virtuous cycle that could be created here as well. I mean, I would love also to think that the EU hasn't totally given up on us. We're just in that period, you know, after the breakup, where people just need to not see each other for a little while. And that doesn't mean that maybe one day we might get back together, but it would be helpful to not do anything particularly stupid during that period to preclude that from happening. And I would hope that if we got to the point where, you know, the British government said, we want better relations, we want to deepen our relationship, this is the aim, a change in mood music, and some of the language at points from the government so far have been certainly less abrasive than the Conservative Party prior, that a conversation could be had about leaving various doors open. But it is also a fact that the further we diverge, the more difficult that medium and longer term aim is going to be. So I think it's right that we see it in those terms, given where the economy is. I mean, Rachel Reeves is about to deliver a budget that is going to be asking departments that are already cut to the bone to deliver even more cuts. It's depressing. And yet they don't want to even consider the start of rebuilding that relationship, the single biggest intervention in the economy that would help to fill that black hole that the Tories have left behind. Yes, the Tories are to blame, but the government now is in a position to change that. And I'm really struggling, as positive as I am, that at least it's not the Tories, that they aren't actively engaging in those conversations.
But hang on, let me try and pin you down a bit here. That economic gain is essentially largely the single market, to some extent the customs union. Whether you do youth mobility, whether you do alignment, in aggregate macroeconomic terms, it's utterly trivial.
They're small, but they are, so the plan that Liberal Democrats have, appreciate, you don't just rebuild a relationship by going to the end. You have to start somewhere. So it is a gradual build.
But again, it's quite a...
If you can't even do that, how can you do the single market?
But it's quite bold, isn't it, to say there is something we might end up doing in possibly decades, and because of that, we're going to deny ourselves any regulatory freedom, even where it is obvious that EU rules are harming us.
But is that the case? And you know, if you're going to take VAT on school fees as an example, I mean,
I don't mean that particularly.
But that's the first example of it. I mean, where else have we actively diverged in a way that's so obvious? So I just think they need to be mindful. If they're going to do it, make it worth it. I'm just not sure that was the thing to do it on, and be very honest about the fact that if we're going to diverge, it's then going to make it more difficult down the line, and appreciate the consequences of that.
Just something on your new role as chair of the Select Committee. I mean, there's an awful lot to talk about here. I mean, just two things before I open it up to the floor. I mean, the first thing is, how convincing do you find West Streeting's love affair with technology?
Actually, I think as often is the way when people are sort of new to Whitehall, they think that sort of technology is going to solve a lot of it. There is something very interesting, and I took a holiday during the conference recess to sort of recover a bit, because we had the election, then went straight into it, and took with me a big bunch of reading, and some people on the beach were like, are you studying for an exam? And I'm like, actually, kind of, yeah. And one of them was the Darcy report. Now, I bet in this room there are people who love graphs as much as I do. If you have not downloaded or printed off the 300 graph appendices of analyses that the Darcy report has, I would encourage you to do so, because they are extraordinary. What I'm curious to see in the report, and I would agree with it instinctively feels right, is that in the NHS we've been putting more money in places like hospitals. We actually have more staff than we did before, and yet productivity has decreased to such an extent that it's called the productivity puzzle. And it's been going on for some time in the NHS, and he puts it down to a couple of things. One is partly this digitization. Digitization is different to artificial intelligence, by the way. I think a lot of people conflate the two. When we talk about digitization, I'll give you a really simple example. Maybe some of you have experienced this, and I'm sorry if you have. I did quite recently. You go into hospital. I had sepsis before the election. It was not a great experience, but I learned a lot. And one of the things that they cannot do in hospitals is convert your notes into PDFs to be able to send to your GP. I asked my my medical colleagues who I speak to about these things, what is the single most innovative thing that the NHS could do for you? And they said, the ability to send a PDF. That is digitization. It's very basic. There are computers running Windows 98 live in the NHS right now. That is the level. So actually just modernizing in a digital way, the NHS. That's important. And then there's the separate thing, a very, very interesting area, which is the use of artificial intelligence, particularly in diagnostics. Now, that's fascinating. There's a whole new sector called oculomics that's starting to blossom, where they take pictures of your retina, and through that, using AI, they're able to predict not just if you're going to get macular degeneration or whatever, but actually if you might have early stage Parkinson's, or you've got kidney issues, or it's just absolutely fascinating. Some of the stuff that's going to come from this will be revolutionary, but let's focus on the basics. So I think on that, he probably has a point.
But the other thing that Darzi and others have picked up with this productivity puzzle, I mean, it's partly capital, isn't it?
And capital expenditure is huge.
But it's also social care.
Yes.
Which is these people in hospital who are perfectly well, but we've got nowhere to send them. Now, the Lib Dems talked a lot about social care during the election, and I imagine you're going to talk a lot about social care in your position of chair. But presumably, to solve social care, because both governments have tried. Andy Burnham tried in 2010. Theresa May tried in 2017. The other side shot it down in flames, both sides. You need to get the two big parties working together on this, don't you? And is that even possible?
Well, I hope so, because the time has come. And you're right. So places like the Health Foundation have done some analysis of, they don't like to call it bed blocking.
Yeah.
It's delayed discharge is the way they prefer to talk about it. And, I saw it for myself when I was on the ward. There was an elderly lady who had been there for 2 weeks, and she was kind of fine, actually. She'd gotten over the acute thing that she went in for, but there was just nowhere for her to go that was safe. And so she was on the ward for 2 weeks, and, the nurses were like, we don't really know what to do. And that is a delayed discharge. And then just out of curiosity, I looked up how much one of those beds costs a night, and it was circa £500. That's a lot of money. That's one person. You multiply that across the whole of the NHS, let alone all the extra strain that it puts on the system. It comes to, I understand, somewhere north of sort of £1.5 billion just to the NHS itself. And that's before you start looking at, well, how many people in this country, because of a lack of provision in social care, go part-time to look after their elderly parents, or decide, in fact, that they can't even work at all and live off their savings, claim carers allowance, and they're not, therefore, contributing to the economy, and the exchequer is not getting that tax take. That's actually where I think we need to start looking. I personally think the Treasury needs to start looking at some of the medium and long-term issues in our country in a slightly different way. Yeah. The way they work, and it's just not common sense. If you were a business, if you even were a household, you would consider the medium and longer term in terms of sort of borrowing and spending in longer than 5-year terms. The Treasury doesn't think of it that way for a couple of reasons. One, there are the fiscal rules, and those of you who are following politics, and I'm sure that's many people who are listening in, will know that the proportion of debt needs to be falling after 5 years. That, in a sense, is, you can decide your rules, and it's political decision as to how you do that. I understand why they've got it. The proportion of debt that we pay in our country is greater, nearly as great as what we spend on the NHS, just servicing the payments. So I understand why they want to get that down. But there is also something we all understand, which is you spend to save. And the argument that we're trying to make about social care is it's not just a saving in the NHS, but actually you would end up recouping a lot of that latent potential by spending on it. Where politicians have really disagreed is on the how. So we had the Dilnot inquiry, which talked about a cap. You then had the Theresa May idea. I met the man who came up with it, by the way. That was an interesting conversation. And she ballsed up the politics. But that was a flaw. The idea being that no matter, where if you're very, very rich, you will end up with 100,000. But if you've got less than 100,000, you won't lose anything. And if you've got 102,000, you'll spend 2. And everyone ends up with the same. That's called a floor, not quite the same as a cap. A cap is you add it all up. When you hit a certain amount, then you stop paying more. Arguably, a floor is more progressive because those who have more pay more, and those who have less pay nothing or very little. And then you've got other ideas like free personal care, which is what was suggested by a Lords Select Committee report and was one of the things that we were looking at. And you have a combination of all of these things. From my perspective, any of these things are important to talk about. In my view, it's for the government to do something. But fundamentally, we need to fund the basics of social care correctly. It's about paying carers properly. It's about making sure local authorities have the money that they need to be able to build their own care homes. So many of the private providers, and I'm not saying there's anything, I'm not a purist when it comes to public versus private. I just think it needs to work. But so many of them aren't incentivized to work with others. The way the commissioning works is wrong. And they've identified roughly £8 billion that needs to be found to just fix the system as is, let alone institute anything else. We do need cross-party support for this, but actually I think we had an election where it became very clear from the public they want them to solve it. And this is where my committee could play a part, I would hope.
Okay, we've got a few minutes left, so if you've got any questions for Layla in the room, do put your hand up. There is a mic at the back. And Miriam, I'm going to let you choose. I mean, I will say, though, just about the private thing, though, the number of private equity firms that own care homes and children's homes is a bit of a disgrace.
It is.
I don't know where the mic is, but if you've got it, shout up.
Hi Layla, really interesting, thanks for coming. As a member of a generation who are going to be the first one less well off than their parents, I'm intrigued as to what your party's offering is to young people like myself who have probably found a more natural home, slightly left of centre with the Labour Party, and whether that's down to the location of the Labour Party seats being more inner city and your new 76 seats being politely slightly older people with more affluent. So I'm just intrigued as to kind of what you see your offering is to us and how you plan to kind of win us over come the next election, whenever that may be.
We take a couple together.
Sure.
Is that right? Are there any?
Thank you both for a very insightful discussion. My question was, you mentioned Labour's vote share and equated it with the number of seats they got. Another interesting comparison is Reform got 4.1 million around about, and the Liberal Democrats got 3.5, but like so many more seats. I just wanted to ask, a lot of people are expecting the Conservatives to be the ones to combat Reform, or maybe Labour because the northern seats, Reform are second in a lot of them, and also the current government. I just want to ask, what is the Liberal Democrat approach to Reform in terms of engaging with voters and also engaging with Reform politicians?
Mm-hmm.
Two easy ones there.
Yeah. So offer to young people. I would argue, and I would say this, wouldn't I, but where we have young people in our seats where we were able to put forward our offer to them, they did vote for us. In part because young people did what everyone else did, which was want to get the Tories out. When I have spoken to young people in my own area, I've got Oxford University, also Oxford Brookes, we point out that as Liberals, we're very much on the progressive side of societal arguments. We talk a lot about mental health. One of my personal passions, and I will try and institute this in the committee, is to talk much more about mental health. When we talk about housing, and it is thorny, but actually what we want is opportunity for young people. And our concern with the way that a lot of the house building happens is that you end up building homes that, is not a first home. It's 300, 400,000 and above, and actually that's just out of reach for a lot of people. So where we were able to make those arguments, I would simply push back and say young people in our areas were voting for us. But I understand what you're saying from a national narrative perspective. I understand that. If you look back over the history of when the Liberal Party did best, often it's when Labour are in government. Because we are able to show, and I spoke earlier about, how we find the axes that people talk about politics, the left and the right, doesn't quite match our own view of ourselves. We are able to better demonstrate that actually we have some of these answers for younger people. So I suspect that over the course of this Parliament, as we see Labour in government giving us a bit more space to be able to campaign in those areas, that we will have a more obvious offer. But I also wouldn't say that that's a deviation from anything we've ever been. It's just a function of where you guys are able to hear from us. We don't have the same outlets. It's true, it is an excuse, it is, and it's on us to come out to you. I'm not blaming voters. I hate it when politicians do that. Oh, they should pay more attention. No, it's on us. But where we are able to make those strong arguments, we do find that young people do vote for us and recognise that actually, we've got a unique offer, strong welfare state, strong internationalism. We talk about aid. We had the most progressive view on Gaza. I will take credit for that because that was very much my passion. So on all of these things, actually, we are talking their language, but we often don't get it across. And on reform, I've got a lovely anecdote for you. So the very first day that we all sat on the green benches together, it was all a bit of a tussle. For us, it was all brand new, because we normally sit, for those who are keen observers of Parliament, on the third row on the opposition side. And suddenly we got to sit on the front 2 rows. So that was exciting. And half of the third. But come along reform, and they don't know those rules. And so they start trying to sort of jostle for our seats at the front, and we got this sort of all call from the whips going, a reformer trying to steal our seats, come, come, come and protect them. And then finally, Nigel Farage shows up, and I wasn't there, I was in the front row, and the ones who sat next to him said, he had clearly been having a few drinks over lunchtime, he's reeked of cigarettes, and a couple of my colleagues are like, I can't be in the same shot as him. I can't be in the same shot. So there was this whole tussle about who's going to be the one to sit next to Farage, and there was this whole thing. I think they're quite unpleasantly surprised by Parliament. They've got no select committee seats because of their position. Farage, as we know, is not spending all that much time in Clacton. Surprise, surprise, who could have predicted that? But actually, Parliament is treating them the same way they would any other party of that size, and they aren't really liking it. This was a big success for them that they got 4 elected, but actually their ability to influence things is very small. So I think they're going to struggle. So what's our approach? Well, we're just going to they're going to find out that system, they don't really like it. In the national conversation, I accept that challenge. I think in a lot of the seats where we are strong, we don't have much of a reform vote. And I do think that they are potentially equally dangerous to both the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. Where the Tory Party is making a mistake, in my view, is that they've basically abandoned the middle ground. We are eating that up quite happily. And their view is the reason that they lost so badly is because they weren't right enough. And as we've seen with the Jenrick versus Badenoch race, that is the direction that party is going down. I think many of the moderate Conservatives I know also recognise that this is a mistake and are just sort of biding their time. What's our approach? I think electoral reform's important. I actually don't agree with those who say we need to keep first past the post because we need to keep reform and those out. If you think back to when reform, you might remember in the form of UKIP, had won loads of councillors and even won councils. Do you remember they ran a council? They were elected out because they were rubbish at it. I genuinely believe if that is a view that is held, it should be represented in our democracy. And then by the virtue of being hoisted by their own petards, they're probably going to get voted out at the next election. And it is for us to make those active arguments. So if you believe in proportional representation, you have to accept that there will be some of those parties that you just don't really agree with at all. And you have them in an intellectual sense, you have it out, and you try and win that argument.
So we look forward to you making common cause with Nigel Farage in favour of electoral reform.
Do you know, they try and do that. It is interesting. Yeah. And they've tried to do it in the past, but they don't really campaign on it. So let's see.
There's a lady there who had a hand up quite early.
You spoke a lot about local government. I was interested to hear your thoughts on how last year so many councils have gone bankrupt. Thinking of Birmingham City Council. I'm just interested to sort of hear your view on that.
Thank you. Do you want to take a couple? Or?
Yeah.
Oh, hello. I just had a question. So, in your view, how can the Lib Dems hold the government to account where UK aid spending is involved? And how might this be challenged by the upcoming Conservative leadership election?
Thank you very much, both of you. You're right about local government finances. So there was a feeling at the beginning, and we can prosecute the coalition come home, but and it is very difficult. I think one of the things that happened in that time was it wasn't just that they got less money, but a lot of the ring fencing of money for basic services were gone. And I don't know if people have seen the effect of getting rid of Sure Start centres has had there was a really quite harrowing chart that showed that where Sure Start centres had continued, actually the crime rate in the immediate area of those Sure Start centres decreased. Well, who'd have thought that if you gave children the best possible start in life, that they might not turn to crime down the line? And it's just such a tragedy. There were decisions that individual councils could make about that, and we fought against it locally, and it was really hard to watch. And I did not agree with a lot of the stuff that was happening at the time. It was a difficult time. However, we need to now appreciate that if there was any bone, fat to be trimmed from those bones, they went a long time ago. And in my experience of local government, they are actually incredibly efficient at delivering what people want. They are often much closer to those decisions. They are often more tuned in to the minutiae of, basic things. How often do you want your bins emptied? Do you want, low traffic neighborhoods or not? And maybe that's not a conspiracy theory that we want to go down. But actually, I think local government is a brilliant mechanism to demonstrate that democracy is really relevant to people. When their bins go wrong and they see potholes in the road, people think, well, if they can't get that right, how can they get anything else right? And I totally agree with them on that point. So fundamentally, they do need more money. Birmingham's an interesting case, in part because there were a couple of things that went wrong, a big IT system that was poorly delivered, and also historic equal pay measures. So I wouldn't want to judge the whole of local government by the failure of one. And where we have seen local authorities go bankrupt, very often that then follows with a change in the polls. The Liberal Democrats picked up Woking, I think it was, and then it went bankrupt a few weeks later. I mean, obviously they weren't the cause of it. How could you after just a few weeks of being in executive power? But there is a general sense of a lack of resilience in local government. And then we perhaps shouldn't say that because there's been a few that have gone bankrupt for bad reasons, that actually that shows that all of them are bad. Actually, most are pretty good at spending their money, are worth investing in. And I'm heartened in the health of social care space, how people keep talking about a neighbourhood NHS. This is good language. The NHS is a opaque thing that most people don't really engage in and is very hard to hold to account even as an MP. But there is a body called the Integrated Care Partnership that is meant to sit with local authorities and third sector that deliver a strategy that's meant to then be commissioned by the integrated care boards. I think those should be strengthened, that partnership between local authority, third sector, and the NHS. There is a sweet spot there, and I think there's a big role for local authorities to play in that. And very quickly on UK aid spending, I'm really genuinely proud that it was the Liberal Democrats that brought the bill that enshrined the 0.7% of spending of GNI on aid into law. It was started in the Lords, it was continued in the Commons. And the reason for that is, frankly, it is the moral thing to do, it's the right thing to do across the world. We can talk about our country's history and all of that and the debt we owe to others, but actually it's also pure self-interest. DFID was the most brilliant soft power we had, and it was cut to the quick in that decision to reduce to 0.5. And we've now seen that because of the mismanagement of the asylum system, the proportion of GDP that's actually going abroad is diminishing such that I think Bond yesterday said that it's possible that at the next budget it will go down to 0.36% when it should be 0.7. So what are we going to do? We're going to keep shouting about it. We're really proud that it was us that enshrined that in law. And we agree that we need to get control of the asylum system, but actually it is also a political choice to not top that up. I'm finding it quite interesting that people like Andrew Mitchell, who was a Conservative MP who ended up in the Foreign Office nominally as International Development Secretary who sits in Cabinet, is now making very strong noises that this was a mistake. So, I don't really know what to do with that. But it is a mistake and it needs reversing, purely for our self-interest, and also it's the right thing to do.
Just on local council funding, do you think it's time we revisited council tax and reformed it as a way of providing more revenue?
There's so many of these kinds of taxes that probably do need reform. And people talk about, having a sort of levy on land and, land value taxation. And if you want, the Liberal Democrats have 1 million policy papers on that. Our concern about why it wasn't included in the election is just a general worry that a lot of working people have had the highest tax burden for some time. And that's in part to do with changes at the top end, but actually the freezing of the tax thresholds is the thing that's brought a lot of people into higher tax bands. There is a conversation that does need to be had about things like this. I'm just not sure now is the time to do it, because there are other ways that we might be able to raise the money that isn't going to affect, you know, people in communities in that sense. Business rates is the one that we're really pushing on. So business rates are long due reform. They are bonkers in how they're calculated. They make no sense for businesses, they make no sense for councils. I think that's the lower hanging fruit, and politically that's the easier one to talk about currently.
Okay, we can take one, possibly two, if you're very, very quick, because I'm meant to finish it. Paul.
Thank you. My name is Paul Adamson. I live in Brussels. I know your father quite well.
No.
I think a lot of people were quite surprised in the general election campaign that Liberal Democrats seem to display the same level of caution on EU relations as a Labour Party. But now the elections are way behind us. Does your party have a strategy, or at least does it see political advantage in being more overtly pro-European than the Labour Party?
Yeah, thank you. You're right, we were cautious about it. It was in the and I will stand by that, because I made sure it was on my brief that we made sure the whole of our policy, not a part of it, all of it, ended up in the manifesto, and that's important. And where I was able to talk about it within the context of my brief, I did. We also recognised, and some of this has come out from polling, if you ask people now, what is the top concern in the country, whilst at the last election, not last one, but the one before, in 2019 general election, it was near top. You know, it was just so important to people. If you ask them in the months in the run-up to the very last election, it just wasn't. And my background is as a teacher. I believe you start where they are. If you want to convince people to come towards your position, it is unhelpful to go to the end first, when actually what they're thinking about is, you know, and we know there's cost of living, NHS, whatever it is. So you start where they are, and then in the undertones, particularly in the conversation around the economy, we did talk about it, but it was never first. And so people who are overtly pro-European were like, why aren't you talking about this? This is the whole reason, it's the cause, it's the solution, it's all of it. Yes, but you're not the one I now need to convince. You know, if you are that way inclined, you probably have read the manifestos, you probably recognised that ours went further, much further than the Labour Party's. The people we really needed to convince were people who weren't there, are people who were thinking about different things, and then we needed to make that argument. But you'll hopefully also have noticed, you know, Ed has chosen to talk about Europe in his PMQs. We are starting to talk about this more because it's important, because we do want to push Labour on this. We have been more forthright on this historically. We are not suddenly not pro-European, and that's just in our DNA. So yes, we are talking about it, but I understand the frustration that people showed during the election. I partly shared it, but I think also by having 172 seats, yes, it's not all us, but the strategy did work, didn't it?
I mean, I'm absolutely stupefied because we finished exactly on time.
Hurrah, that's good chairing.
Absolute first for this. Layla, thank you so much for coming. I don't know if you've got time to hang around and have a quick drink afterwards.
Absolutely.
Or not, but thank you all for coming in. Can you just give Layla a clap?
Thank you so much. Thank you. No, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.